In this roundup of a week, we ponder the massive worldwide experiment on resilience the world community is engaged with, and we look at more evidence of how the experience is reshaping the immediate future when it comes to climate change. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Change Makers. Well, here we are in the absolutely massive social experiment that is 2020. I hope you're well, hope you're staying safe. You're almost certainly familiar with the saying, popularly believed to be an old Chinese curse, although there's no evidence that that's actually true. May you live through interesting times. Historically, interesting times means things like war, famine, plague, and so on. And you have to say, these are certainly interesting times. Half of the economy just flat out closed down for the foreseeable future. Vast majority of air travel wiped out. Vulnerable people shut up in exclusion. Large numbers of us learning the new rules of keeping apart from others as much as we can. All live sports cancelled. The Eurovision Song Contest is cancelled, so there are definitely some silver linings to be found. But you get the general idea. Extraordinary times. A couple of things occur to me looking at all of this. First of all, this is going to be a massive unparalleled experiment with the world system. We have, for the last few decades, been living in an increasingly interconnected world. Just-in-time delivery of essential goods, many of which come from halfway around the world. That interconnectedness has been part of the world's resilience as we've grown as a species. Vastly more people in the world, 7 billion. Than the world has ever seen before. Supported by our use of the best places in the world for growing food at scale, and the best places in the world to mine and manufacture at scale, and then for all the results of that activity to flow freely across the world wherever it's needed. Some of the climate change catastrophists that I've covered before on this channel have highlighted that very interconnectedness as a potential point of failure. As soon as there's a blip, the systems will break down, the food shops will empty, and there'll be riots. Everyone will starve or be killed by their neighbours. Now, without being in that scenario, because the actual production of food isn't in question, we're nevertheless in a situation where the strength of our societies are about to be stress tested. So far, we've seen some panicking, although concern for getting enough loo roll hasn't yet turned into deadly violence. We've seen lots of other examples of people being collaborative or compassionate, helping each other out and doing what they can for the community. And of course, there are some young people still partying as though none of it really matters to them. The consequences of all that interconnectedness is taking some time to be felt, but it's on the way. For instance, 75% of US companies have seen supply chains disrupted, which is not surprising because an analysis of the top 1,000 companies worldwide showed that they had between them 12,000 facilities in quarantined areas of China, Italy and South Korea. And with more and more areas entering into lockdown status, the impact is only being amplified with every passing day. In the short term, that's a logistical problem to be solved. And although there will be problems of all sorts in the coming weeks, generally I would be optimistic that the companies we most depend on will solve those problems and make sure we get through this. In the UK, we've already seen the retailers successfully pushing the government to suspend anti-competition rules, which means they'll be able to collaborate together to get a steady supply of all the essentials into the shops to meet the enhanced demand. I talk about and promote change makers on this channel. And when I've spoken to young people on that topic in the past, I've always said to them, wherever you find yourself, whether in the private sector, the charitable sector, the public sector, wherever, you can always take the opportunities in front of you to make a positive difference to the world. Right now, we have a lot of people, hospital workers, drivers, food producers, supermarket workers, and a lot more besides, who are rising up to the occasion, doing what they can to serve their community. And we should say to those people the same thing we often reserve to the people in our armed forces, which is thank you for your service. If we prove to be a resilient society that comes out of this challenge intact, it'll be because of those people, along with anyone else that takes the position of doing their bit to help pull us through. When I did my takedown of the influential catastrophist paper of Jem Bendel a while ago, I referred to a research paper that I'd looked at what factors made a society prone to collapse over history. You may remember it mapped out 2 potential routes a society could take once it was hit by a trigger for a societal crisis. One saw the rallying of people in charge and the influencers, the so-called elites, the emergence of leadership and social transformation. That was a response that came from a place of resilience that led to survival. The other saw polarization between the people in charge and the influencers, the intra-group conflict, political simplification and loss of authority. That was the response that came from a place of instability, which potentially led to collapse. Those choices are playing out right now on a country level across the world. There is also the element of international cooperation in terms of how goods get transported and delivered, and that makes a difference as well. In the UK, I think by and large, people are rallying and uniting. I wouldn't say that the divisions of Brexit have become just a memory or anything like that, but there is so much more of a common cause now than there has been in this country for quite a long time. In the US, trending towards the opposite. I'm not saying it will settle there. It's partly because the country is at a different point in the electoral cycle where the UK is. So polarisation is very much its state of mind. Lots of energy going into people attacking each other. That said, I noticed today that even Ilhan Omar, one of the most trenchant critics of President Trump, recently tweeted to praise the measures being taken by the president, calling it the right sort of leadership. So maybe, just maybe, even there the country can pull together. And even if not, it doesn't necessarily mean it gets worse from this point, but there are a number of other places where resilience is a big question mark on the US right now. The growth in the national debt, when the promise had been that it would be reduced, hasn't been helpful. If half of all the economy is about to sit at home and watch Netflix for the next 6 months, and the fact that the US health system is the way that it is, in other words, a health insurance system, not a health system per se, makes it more vulnerable in this sort of position. All of which is important because we will be bearing the cost of this for some time to come. The UK just came through a long period of austerity and had just got to the point of introducing a budget with enhanced spending after all the difficult times. And now the government's basically going to be giving everyone a bunch of money just to get them through the next year, regardless of what they do. And he's doing that on borrowing. So as soon as the crisis is over, it will be time once again to pay the bills. These are the sorts of crises that do bring down empires. And I mean literally. I recently read about the life of Genghis Khan, how he created one of the most successful empires in the world, the Mongol Empire. You might think that Genghis Khan was just some thug that went around being extremely unpleasant to other people. And there was some of that. But he also understood the value of trade. And he built the Mongol Empire on the absolute prioritization of a free flow of goods. And that enabled the empire to thrive for quite some time after he'd left the scene. Right up until the arrival of the Black Death. Suddenly, free movement of people around the empire was completely curtailed. Everyone went into lockdown, and without the constant benefits of material wealth flows, the strength behind the empire was quickly sapped, and it collapsed under its own weight. Sound vaguely familiar? Now, of course, the technologies were different. The resilience that was possible was much less. It's an interesting historical example. In no way does it have to be a template of what happens in the modern context. But you can't count it out that it might. Because we've never done this before. We are literally making this up as we go along. And we're being judged by something that doesn't care about our hubris, doesn't have sentimentality or fear nor favour, doesn't read Twitter, doesn't read the Financial Times. Countries that get this wrong will just have more dead people. You can't argue with that as a result. Italy has become the example of the fact that this can go badly wrong. Yes, it has a higher proportion of older people than most populations. It also had a population stubbornly wedded to its social behaviours that ignored a lot of the early advice to withdraw. There may be a lot more that comes out after the event when we get the full range of data, because on the face of it, it doesn't actually seem that Italy was that different to Japan, which has not seen such an explosion. Japan's the only country to have more old people than Italy, It's also not instigated a lockdown, and it's as crowded a country as you can see, with a lot of people in close proximity in public transport, but no explosion. Now, is that purely because culturally the Japanese don't do all the handshaking, the cheek kissing, the other routine physical contact that Italians have done, and that hand washing is a much more standard feature of behaviour than it is in Europe? The only honest question right now is that we don't know. Anyway, a couple of other observations. One is, I find this fascinating that we're doing this at all. You know, there have been plenty of times in human history where we've had worse diseases as part of a routine background of life, and life just carried on. We bore the cost, dreadful cost, as it was. I mean, to be fair, we often didn't know what we could do differently at the time. We didn't understand how such diseases were carried. But even so, there are going to be enormous costs borne as society as a result of the actions we're taking right now in terms of the economy. It's going to put a real strain on everything that we've taken for granted. And yet, there hasn't been any debate about this. To save lives, we are completely reshaping how society works in the short term. On the one hand, I think that says good things about the value we place on human life. I'm glad that modern society is prepared, in the short term at least, to go to such lengths. Maybe it won't be sustainable. Maybe life will become that bit more brutal where we take a certain higher rate for granted than we would have preferred. But it's not where we started. I think the other part of it is that although we spent the last few decades apparently thinking how invulnerable we are, how our society is built on rock-solid foundations and nothing substantial could ever change, actually we've very quickly shown that underneath we know that we're incredibly exposed and vulnerable. We know that something can come along that might make the whole edifice come crashing down. When people let go and take part in panic buying, it's really what they're saying. We take none of this for granted. We know none of this is as secure as the authorities would like to suggest. It's not something to allow to dominate. We'll do better with the majority of such crises by working together, not by breaking ranks and being self-centered. But it's not unhelpful to have a concerned mindset. Right now, I'm reading a book about why some companies fail, How the Mighty Fall by Jim Collins. You might not be much interested in businesses, but they sort of operate as a microcosm, human society in some ways. Research on what are the stages that failing companies went through included stage 1, hubris, when the company is successful and the people in it become arrogant and overconfident. They come to conclude that they will always be successful just because they are who they are. Nations and their leaders are entirely capable of such hubris. The second stage is when, fueled by such hubris, they begin to overreach, trying to do things that won't work and failing to pay attention to the core elements that make them successful in the first place. The third stage then is that when the first signs appear that all might not be well, they are dismissed as unimportant, the denial phase. And then it becomes impossible to ignore, so the business starts thrashing around, casting around, increasingly desperately trying to fix the problem until it finally acquiesces and accepts failure. The companies that don't suffer that fate start with leaders who remain humble, curious, and only too aware that however much success they've had, if they take their eye off the ball, it could all come crashing down. I think the way most leaders are responding shows that we as a society are not so fully into our own hubris that we won't respond to genuine threats. For all that there'll always be people carping and criticising, I think that's what I'm seeing. Only time will tell. One clear consequence is going to be that a number of other priorities get kicked down the road. And whether you like it or not, that is going to include action on climate change. It just will. Get used to it. Emissions will be lower for 2020. How much lower, I'm not sure, but clearly substantially lower. The price for that, apart from all the human misery we're going to see in spades over the coming year, is also that progress on agreements on climate change, progress on investment in renewable energy, electric vehicles and all of that will be delayed. So for instance, Bloomberg had forecast that solar power demand would reach around 121 to 152 gigawatts in 2020, now downgraded that forecast to 108 to 143 gigawatts, which would be the first fall in solar capacity addition in 3 decades. Wind power investment slightly less exposed, but still being seen as substantially more risk than they otherwise would have been. And of course, when it comes to electric vehicles, the companies manufacturing them have largely shut down their factories. When it comes to policy, it's not only the UN COP26 conference that's at risk. The European Commission, which recently launched its ambitious Green Deal policies for net zero carbon by 2050, is reorganising its workload and its priorities. For now, it's holding to the target and suggesting it will only be delayed slightly. That's in spite of the lobbying by the Czech Prime Minister to simply forget about the Green Deal. And it's also saying it'll go ahead with carbon trading scheme, even though Poland has been lobbying against that. Other countries such as Austria and France are holding the line much more firmly. But whether that remains the end position still is an open question. In the meantime, everyone else is starting to have to accept that the new normal means that everyone has to change their behaviour. Extinction Rebellion learned this the hard way. They announced this week a major protest against the HS2 high-speed train construction in the UK, where they were going to have activists sitting in trees along the route to stop them from being cut down. Within 2 hours, the backlash to that idea was so strong because it would be adding pressure to police forces when everyone's already at breaking points. They cancelled it and apologised. And you can see the real divide now, I think, between the decent, good-hearted people in the movement and the real ideologues. Extinction Rebellion UK account tweeted this: "Now is the time to use our numbers and our skills to support our communities. If you wish, you can print off the below to use in your street." And what they then had was a variation on a form I've seen across social media, inviting neighbours to let you know if they need help with getting food, walking a dog, caring for children. Now, those are the people with the right idea. There is this big priority now. Let's help our communities get through it. Then you see the real ideologues. So the Roger Hallam Twitter account is all about how the government has failed its primary duty to keep us safe. Because if your purpose is, as Roger has often defined it, to overthrow the government, then anything that could be a crisis represents a weapon to use to take advantage of the moment. Now, of course, it's not a completely black and white thing, but when something as big as this comes along, the grown-ups understand you need to stand together until the crisis has passed. Plenty of time to review what should have been done and what can be criticised after the event. We haven't really been in one of these moments since the Second World War, but by all accounts, that is where we are now. What else happened this week? Well, there is still an election on in the US, and it seems as though Joe Biden has pretty much crushed Bernie Sanders to the point of no return. In a gesture to Sanders' supporters, Biden made a fairly strong climate change push, saying that he would stop oil drilling in the US along with a ban on fracking. He's actually in quite a strong position to do that. However radical an environmental position he adopts, it's going to be many measures less than Sanders was putting forward, so it will seem like the moderate middle ground. And secondly, if there was ever going to be an election where normal rules don't apply, it's really going to be this one. If Americans decide that Trump has been doing a good job with the current crisis, and the latest poll suggests that a bare majority do think that, he may well push through regardless of anything that Biden does. If Americans decide that Biden is the safer pair of hands in a crisis, in spite of his apparent age-related failings, then maybe he will sweep in. In neither scenario is his position on climate change likely to make it onto the radar. I mean, who knows? The campaign will be hard fought and Trump will go for whatever areas where he feels can do the worst damage. Given the circumstances, it's hard to know what this is really going to look like. Before the shutters came down on all human contact, I had the great privilege to interview one of the iconic UK environmental campaigners, Chris Rose. Chris led the Greenpeace campaign on the Shell Brent Spar, which was one of the few successful campaigns that the environmental movement saw against an apparently much more powerful opponent who had the government fully in their support. Not only did he have some thoughts to share on how that was so successful, but he also recently published a very detailed reflection on some of the modern environmental campaigns, Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, some very sharp and thoughtful reflections from someone who has a lifetime of learning of what makes effective campaigning. Here's a little clip from that interview.
He said, well, one of the things he said, we're on climate change, we're waiting for the signal. And I said, what signal? They said, the fiscal, the tax signal. Because if the government is serious about this, then what they're going to do is they're going to fix the tax system so the rate of return on investment is better on renewables than on fossil fuels. Then we'll start our long-term planning and investing. It's going to be a big thing then. We'll shift everything over, but the signal never came.
Yes.
And I think they were like ships that passed in the night, because the politicians thought there was a technological process which means that renewables, without them doing anything, would start to replace fossil fuels. The oil companies thought the government would, if they wanted something to happen, because they thought the government could make anything it liked happen, because that's their experience, because everything was that they did was affected by tax. Most of the value of buying petrol was taxation. That the government would just use a tax system to do this like it had done everything else.
It really was a great discussion, and that will be appearing on this channel on Sunday. I know there's a mixed audience on here, including many who are critical of standard environmentalist voices, but there are some really interesting insights, and I do think you'll find it interesting. Not much time for things that I like or things that I don't, except I do have to note a survey that appeared this week that I have to dislike, although actually I kind of like it, only because I don't believe it's true. Apparently, according to a recent survey, 64% of British millennials believe that the moon landing was fake. And that's bad enough, but if you took all the age groups, it still only gets down to around 50%. As I said, I don't believe it. The stats come from an exercise that was branded as the National Lying Survey. All the earlier questions were about how much people did or didn't lie and in what circumstances. I think by the time they got to this end section, they'd gotten into a special frame of mind. If I tell you that 4% of people agreed that they believe the world is controlled by reptilian lizards, then I think you'll understand what I mean. Not that such a discovery would be even remotely strange by today's standards. Anyway, there it goes. Good luck for the coming week. Stay safe. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.